The National Dialogue Conference regrets any conflicts in Kenya and loss of life and property of any Kenyans. And that's why we have addressed the questions under the national security reforms rather than get micro on the items that you mentioned, because if you improve the national security infrastructure and make it work, then some of those incidences should not happen as it is. But we condemn the laxity sometimes of duty bearers in areas where conflict arises and life is lost. The veracity and robustness of policing in Kenya must include preemption of violence and conflicts and taking to court and prosecuting those who may be inciters in the violence, as sometimes the politicians are. What is the point of departure between NDC and BBI? You notice that we commend the President and the former Prime Minister on their genius of the handshake and the 9-point agenda they put out and a task force to facilitate Kenyan conversation so that the recommendations can be made. That is a process we support. We are already in touch with them and are willing to make presentations to them as is necessary. But as has been said, we think that the issues that bedevo Kenya are large, and that process may not necessarily complete the conversation that is intended. But it is important to tell Kenyans that the National Dialogue Conference, which is a milestone in the journey of the National Dialogue Reference Group that is driven and led by religious leaders, has been on for a long time. And we have wrestled with the issues that we consider critical in Kenya step by step along the way. This conference was actually envisaged way before the BBI was put in place. And this forum is intended to provide an opportunity for Kenyans from amongst the religious leaders and other stakeholders to have a mechanism to engage those issues deeply in the way they have been analyzed. This is only phase one. We hope to go to the counties and roll out these discussions in every county as well, providing people in the counties in a structured manner to discuss and agree their views on the issues that we have put out to culminate in National Dialogue Conference 2. The processes and the outcome from these consultations and dialogue will be made available to BBI so that they are able to integrate them in their processes as is possible. But the National Dialogue Conference intends not just to address the BBI, but to pass our memoranda to all the duty bearers who have a role in reforming Kenya and making it a comfortable home for all of us. And so we are not in conflict with the BBI. We think we have synergy and we have a much wider mandate that is perpetual, because the BBI have a shelf life of 1 year in which they submit their report to the President and the former Prime Minister. This process has been on and will continue way beyond the life of the BBI. Our comment on overrepresentation of Kenya. You notice that in our statement, which is available to the media, and you'll be able to carry copies with you, we say that the outcome of the national promulgation of our new Constitution 2010 appeared to result in a much larger government rather than better government. You notice that we expanded representation at the National Assembly and introduced a Senate, bringing a very high number of elected members of Parliament and Senate to represent Kenyans. At the same time, we instituted the county assemblies and gave them legislative powers. The whole principle of devolution was to make conversation on how people are governed and their resources are utilized get closer to the people. So the county assemblies, in our view, are very important organs and forum. Consequently, we don't think there's a justification for a very bloated representation at the national level. That's why we recommend a clawback on the numbers that are availed in the Senate and the National Assembly so that we can have a more rationalized representation. That would entail merger of some constituencies within the criteria provided for in the Constitution. I don't think, and the religious leaders don't think, that you will tackle the bloated, irrational wage bill unless we are willing to examine our society and rationalize our institutions and functions so that the numbers are rational and wieldy, fulfilling the function without creating employment for people. Why do we suggest that the election petitions for all positions other than the presidency should not be taken to the Supreme Court but end at the High Court and the Court of Appeal? Basically, Kenyans have become very litigious. We think we should endeavor to bring a closure to elections and petitions so that Kenyans can get on with life and business. It is a challenge of the judiciary, if this is accepted by Kenyans, to then ensure that the robustness of the delivery of justice around elections is such that Kenyans will be convinced that justice has been dispensed fully and there is no point bogging down the Supreme Court in tackling pretty mundane issues that ought to be resolved at a lower level. We consider that the Supreme Court was established in particular to be able to resolve disputes around presidential elections because those are weighty and they cover the whole of the country. What's our issue with ballooned borrowing in the face of the president's Big Four agenda? The National Dialogue Conference considers that mobilization of resources for the Big Four representing national priorities is not tantamount only to borrowing. It is really about how we organize our national resources and channel them to the areas where government and the president have declared these are priority. The National Dialogue Conference is concerned that in the recent few years, our borrowing has gone past the roof and we owe a lot of money. Kenyans will recognize that we are not totally convinced that the monies borrowed to support development have all aided in development initiatives and activities and projects, because we also know about the endemic corruption that bedevils this country. We think that fiscal discipline by the government, checking corruption and stopping it in its tracks, better accountability of national resources and the taxes that KRA collects ought to be able to enable us to fund our country, its operations and its development without over-relying on borrowing. After all, every shilling of the borrowed funds must be paid. And the religious leaders and this National Dialogue Conference are asking, do we have a limitless carrying capacity for debt? Shouldn't we as a nation realize that you must cut the cloth that fits you? Thank you very much.